Welcome, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to let a few more people trickle in here and we will get started. Thank you for spending Friday morning with us on a very fun topic. Okay, Belle, I think we should get started because we are recording so people can come back and see if they missed the very beginning of it. One or two are still trickling in, but I would like to introduce Belle Walker, and thank you, Belle, for joining me today on this fun topic. And this is really Belle's world we're living in. And so we're going to have all kinds of fun applying what Belle does to lawyers and law firms. So take it away, Belle.
Thank you so much, Jen. I am very excited to be sharing some of these topics and insights today. I have always been pretty passionate about accountability, but over the years, I've realized there is so much more to the story than the moments and the individual decisions we tend to talk about. But I thought I would kick us off by telling a story. And this is really digging into a client that I worked with a while ago. This was a law firm, and they did employment law primarily on the employer side. When you do employment law, there tends to be a lot of contention in the cases that you're taking, and that means that there's a lot of people involved, not just the folks that they're working with. And so conflict of interest becomes a pretty important piece of screening and onboarding new clients. Guessing I'm not telling anyone in this audience anything they don't know, but a helpful reminder to just set the scene. So as we were going through, I was brought on to help process map their onboarding procedures so that they could more quickly and efficiently train up their new staff. As we were going through the process mapping, one of the pain points that started to come up that I was hearing from the partners was that the conflict of interest check seemed to be happening a little later, maybe a lot later than the partners really wanted it to be. So what was happening was there was a very initial conflict screen, and then the partners were really diving in with these prospects, getting to know the case, getting to know all the players. And after they had put in often a couple of hours, the admin staff would come back and let them know, guess what? There's a conflict. We cannot actually complete this engagement. This was, as you might imagine, a little bit frustrating for the partners, and they were really starting to feel that their staff were just not taking accountability for doing prompt and thorough conflict of interest checks. That word came up with some regularity. There was a lot of frustration brewing. And I'm guessing that this is not the only firm where a situation like this has occurred. But let's take the same story and think about it from the staff perspective. There was a process that had been developed probably 10 years before I was working with them that established how conflicts of interest were determined. It started with this initial screen, and then after the partners had gotten to know the clients and gotten to know all of the parties, the next step was to do this deeper conflict of interest check. I learned quite a bit about what was happening behind the scenes. There's some really cool, detailed sleuthing that was often going into it. It was a lot more complex than I, as a non lawyer, would have assumed. And perhaps most importantly, this process was pretty well established, right? Remember, I was not brought in initially to fix anything about this process, just to document it. And the staff really were completely unaware that there was this challenge or this severe annoyance coming from the partners. I mean, they certainly knew that the partners were frustrated when there was a conflict, but the staff had no idea that the frustration had anything to do with them. They were following the process. And last but not least, the clients were having an experience all their own. They were talking to partners at this law firm that they were hoping could represent them. They were being told, oh, we've checked for conflicts. We're going to really dig into your case now, make sure we can get the engagement letter so that it's all set up correctly. And then all of a sudden, they were told, actually, there is a conflict and we cannot take this case. And of course, this was not happening all the time, right? This was not a super common occurrence, but it was happening enough that I certainly heard about it. And for the clients, They were annoyed and confused. It was not really the positioning, the representation that the partners wanted to have. And so part of the question is, why the heck did this situation persist? What was going on here if this was a known issue? And the way I like to describe this is, this was one of those devil you know cyclones where you just get caught in the frustration and the challenges because you it's comfortable, right? It was frustrating and it was annoying, and the partners felt that the whole process was very inefficient, but they trusted the process. They knew that as long as they followed this, they were getting the results that they needed. They just weren't happy with how it was happening. And this kind of comfortable and familiar form of imperfection is a really common trap that tends to get people very stuck. And there's also a tendency to want to avoid making changes without really thinking through the consequences. And I get it, right? It's like jumping off a cliff and trusting that the water's deep enough. But have you really measured it? Did you see someone else jump? Do you know where you're going? And for someone, for a partner in a law firm, there can be real consequences here. But there's got to be a better way, right? If there are these known pain points, if there are these inefficiencies, these challenges, if there's this lack of accountability that you're seeing in your firm, there's got to be something we can do. So before we move into really what that is, what's going on, I want to turn it over to Jen for a minute to really expound a little bit and set the stage when we talk about accountability in this legal context.
Thank you, Belle. And what I think lawyers and what struck me is when you were talking about was all the different perceptions or perspectives that people don't necessarily see what's all going on in the background. And as lawyers, we tend, well, first of all, I think we tend to think that lawyers are supposed to be stressed and overwhelmed. I think there is a mindset out there that if you're not, then you're doing something wrong. And it doesn't have to be that way. All of these accountability tools and things really can create a structure that makes law firms run smoother, gives you the ability to not be stressed and overwhelmed. But it takes willingness to figure out what those processes and structures look like and to keep updating and changing. Lawyers hate change. We like to do things the way they've always been done. That is what our industry, that is what law school taught us when we were reading cases from the 1800s. That's what we learned, is this is how things are done. And so even not just like traditional accountability, we're worried about malpractice. We're worried about, what judges are going to say, if they're going to yell at us. But also we need to be accountable to each other in the law profession, valuing other ideas, our clients, and just the profession itself. The profession is changing very rapidly. There are all kinds of new technologies and AI out there. How do we stay on top of all of that and keep communicating? So I think looking at it from the legal side of things, there is a lot of accountability roadblocks out there stopping us from getting through this. And I also like to put out here at this point is we should follow our own advice sometimes. We advise all of our clients to get help and figure out their problems, but we tend to be very DIY. We try to do everything on our own. We try to, set up the website. We try to do all these things. And accountability and processes are one of those things where an outside perspective, we should follow our own advice. Look from the outside in instead of trying to figure out why we're twisting and turning in a tornado like Belle had up there on the screen. So if you build accountability into your practice, you will have satisfied clients, colleagues who regularly refer you things because they trust you. And the legal profession, civility has been a big topic. California State Bar just added an hour of civility training for lawyers. That comes along with accountability and being able to stop the blame game and focus on the solutions instead of who we're going to blame for what happened. So that's how I look at it from the legal perspective, the legal lens.
Which I think is a fabulous encapsulation of what you get when you have this all in place. I'm going to take us back for a minute now and talk a little bit about what you get when you don't have clear accountability frameworks in place. Because when we are really talking about accountability, when it becomes a topic of conversation, when it's front of mind, that blame game concept tends to come up, and that often means that there's a bit of a dialogue and what might start to sound like excuses. For example, someone saying, "Well, that wasn't my job." Right. And this is, I'm going to try and relate some of these back to different interpretations of that story I told at the beginning. And in that particular case with the conflict of interest checks, the admin staff really saw themselves as doing their jobs as it was defined for them. They were told their job was to follow this process, and they did not particularly think that it was their job to be looking at the process for opportunities for improvement or efficiency. They had been told your job is to do what we tell you because there are broader consequences that you're just not trained to see, right? All those things that Jen was just going through. And this can be more of a kind of a traditional view of an excuse and an accountability framework, but it isn't always an excuse, right? This is getting into that line between excuses and reasons. Not everyone thinks big picture, right? Some people are very literal in their interpretation. And I think that's something that comes up particularly frequently in the legal context, whether it's lawyers, partners, or really anyone at a law firm. There's a lot of value in taking things at face value. Jen was telling me about someone she worked with who was told that part of their job was to network. And so they would go to networking events, collect business cards, and they were done. Right? There was nothing more to the story. My job is to network, so I networked. And there was a whole broader context that the partners had in their minds around, we want you to network because we see business development, we see furthering the personal brand of our firm as part of your job. That's not what this particular person had heard. And so that level of nuance becomes really important in this context, right? That wasn't my job can really be talking about understandings of what versus why. And we'll get into that a little more and how you might address it later on in the session.
And that wasn't my job can often be a communication issue too. Management didn't necessarily say what the job was, like Belle said, very literal. Um, I had a firm I was working with, and the legal secretary, part of her job description said strong formal and informal networks. But it didn't say that how she was supposed to do that. And she thought she physically had to go out and network. All they meant was talk to people who come in the door and make connections with them. So it was more of a personal like development type thing. So that wasn't my job is probably the most often excuse I hear when I'm talking to law firms and with issues. So it's a good
Yeah,
excuse.
and there's a reason I put it up front.
Yeah. Oh,
It is not just in the legal context, but particularly frequently.
mhm. What's
Which
next,
takes us
Belle? What excuse do we hear next?
next. We hear, well, I couldn't have done that anyway, right? And this can have a lot of different meanings here. It might be, well, I didn't have the skills to do that. I didn't have the resources to do that. I didn't have the authority to do that. I didn't have the time to do that, which is maybe a variation on resources. But this is one that I hear particularly often when people are reflecting on a situation. And so this is something that I tend to think of as a bit of a look back excuse, right? Something didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Well, I couldn't have done it anyway. And so this is often a knee jerk reaction. And I see this excuse come up particularly frequently when there is a culture of blame, right? The blame game that we've been talking about, this tends to be where people throw up their hands and say, meh, I just not, this is outside the scope of what we're looking at. And this is also something that, again, all of these can be excuses and can be genuine reasons, right? Sometimes you don't have the time, the resources, the authority. And I'm going to keep saying authority because this is something that I see with lawyers. This may shock you. Lawyers like to control things. And lawyers often like to be very much in the loop and on top of everything that is happening in their firm. And that can have positive benefits and that can have some challenges, particularly when you simultaneously want your team to take initiative and do things on their own, but only when they're doing exactly right, exactly the way you want them to at all times. It
I'm
may
shocked,
not,
Belle. I'm shocked. Attorneys have control issues.
you never think it.
Never. Nope.
So this is one that when I see it as a reason, not just an excuse, it tends to be particularly common when there are organizations that are very rigid in their practices and expect people to follow exactly the directions they've been given, to keep the control with partners, with the most senior folks in the firm, but those senior folks don't actually have the resources either to be that far in the weeds, and so this becomes a little bit of a, well, I couldn't have done that, and suddenly everyone is saying, well, I couldn't have done that for their own reasons.
And I do see this a little bit too as time management issues that attorneys have. We talk about getting people trained and resources and things like that, but we're not really great at giving the resources and training because we're trying to do it. It gets into your next excuse, I think, that you're going to get into. But we do have time management issues. We want to delegate sometimes, we don't know how, and then we also don't want to lose control. So it's like this weird catch 22 we find ourselves in, that then employees aren't given the authority to do the things they need to do because they just don't have the skill or resources given to them by the firm.
And sometimes they do have the skills and resources, and so this is another uh, again, excuse slash reason. And this one I see come up both sometimes in the middle of something going wrong, which I'm going to put in quotes because when you're in the middle, you don't guaranteed know that it was going to go off the rails, or as a retrospect. There have been a ton of times where I have seen people having the accountability conversation, and the person who was uh, leading the charge, who dropped the ball, who was not taking accountability, says, well, I was handling it. And then at the very last moment, something went totally sideways, right? They're genuinely confused and surprised that the outcome was not what everyone wanted. As far as they were concerned, they were on top of everything, everything was under control. And then all of a sudden it went sideways. Or as far as they're concerned, things are going the way they want, things are under control. And all of a sudden, somebody else has swooped in and said, this is a disaster, this is a huge problem, what is going on? And there's so many reasons for that, right? Of course, sometimes that is the situation. Sometimes things are going sideways, and the person who has been leading doesn't, for some reason, have the knowledge or the perspective to see that things are offset. But this is kind of building on our previous uh, excuses. Did they even know that that was their job or their responsibility? Were they given the resources they needed to have the information to execute that job or responsibility correctly? Um, and if not, why did they think that they were totally on top of this? Is there a skill gap there? This can be, this can feel like it comes out of left field for everyone involved, right? The person who is frustrated about the lack of accountability is shocked that the person who was handling it is not more upset. Person who was handling it may genuinely feel like, what is going on? I was handling this. There's so many ways that these situations can come out, uh, particularly when there are these very specific roles with very different context and information.
And some of this is perspective too. I was working with a firm last week on on a client experience problem they were having. And the client was like, it was la 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 la, everything is fine. All of a sudden the client would email blowing up, like, I'm so confused at what's going on in my case. I don't know. And the attorney was just caught off guard. They're like, We just updated last week and nothing has, nothing has moved, but the client expected something very different than what the attorney expected. So it was not even I was handling it as much as I thought I was handling it, but not the way the client expected it to be handled. So it's always really interesting to see communication and how lack of communication in both directions can cause all of these issues.
It's almost like there's a theme here around communication and accountability that may continue through the rest of this session. And that brings us to the last excuse slash reason we're going to talk through today, which I am just calling oops. And it's one that we have to acknowledge, right? Sometimes everything that can be done ahead of time has been done ahead of time, and it still does not end up resolving in the way that you want it to. Somebody is unhappy, somebody is upset, there is an issue that has arisen, and this can be anything from a genuine we talked about this and I forgot, or a mistake. We are humans. We have law firms made up of humans. Human error will occur, and it could be that there are gaps that we just didn't see coming, right? We'll get more into types of errors, types of failures, types of mistakes a little bit farther on in the session. But the reality is that no matter how much pre planning you do, we are never going to be able to imagine every possible twist and turn that reality is going to throw at us. And so sometimes something is going to come up that just wasn't on the radar. And that can also lead us to one of these oops moments.
But Belle, attorneys don't make mistakes. Just ask them.
And even if our attorneys never make mistakes, our attorneys employ actual humans who might.
And I think the hard part attorneys have is admitting that there has been a mistake, because we're so ingrained to never admit anything's wrong, because part of our profession is advocating. And so I think this is an especially hard one for attorneys to see.
And I'm hoping that as we get into some of the taxonomies around how to think about and classify and approach
Yep.
some of these oops moments, that will make a really big difference in allowing attorneys, especially, to engage with some of these concepts, because there's ways to think about it where this can actually be a good thing.
And
Maybe
actually can improve your lifestyle too. So yes.
All right, so if any of these struck close to home and you are thinking, oh man, I have heard that too many times. Why did you spend so long on that slide that I'm sick of hearing about? What could we do differently? How do we get out of a situation when we're spending a lot of our time circling around these excuses, these conversations, these moments? And we're going to propose something pretty straightforward, right? We're going to say, let's take a step back and let's approach accountability as a process rather than a moment. So instead of only talking about accountability when something has gone wrong or is about to go horribly wrong and is on the brink of disaster, let's try to avoid some of these issues, some of these confusions, these communication gaps, these errors. And I tend to think of this as a pretty simple process, only 3 steps. I didn't even bother with arrows because there's only 3 of them. They go left to right. The first thing we do is set the stage, then we engage, and then we reflect and adjust. Of course, it's not quite that simple. I'm starting with setting the stage. This is a little more complex, and this is actually going to be the heart of the session. So we're going to spend the next little while really digging in. What does it mean to lay the foundation, lay the groundwork? If I'm telling you that we're going to be preempting a lot of these challenges and conversations, you can imagine setting the stage is where we do the hard work there. So there's 5 components to this, and we'll dig into a little bit into each of them. And we will also be tying these back to which of the common excuses slash reasons we see for these accountability gaps and failures down the line. We're going to start with roles and responsibilities, talk about priorities, talk about some of the tools, particularly process maps, because those are near and dear to my heart. Also status checks, and everybody's favorite, asking for help. For roles and responsibilities, this is one where I tend to talk to people and they go, "Oh, we've got our roles and responsibilities totally covered. We have job descriptions." And that's awesome. That is great. I am very excited when people have job descriptions. I also then tend to ask a few follow-up questions. For example, are those job descriptions accurate? Are those job descriptions complete? Has anyone looked at them in the last 10 years? Uh, as particularly with well-established firms and practices, I often find that job descriptions for the partners, for example, are pretty outdated in the context of that particular organization as it has grown and evolved and changed. Or maybe there are partners and now there are associates where there weren't associates before and they have job descriptions for the partners and the paralegals, but the associates are kind of working off a bare bones set of guidelines that, are what you might have posted on Indeed. Probably not Indeed specifically, but what you use to actually hire. What you use to hire and what you use to train, assess, grow, and develop are going to look very different, right? You don't get to put every nuance and detail of a full-time job into a job description. And so thinking that what you posted to hire is going to be enough information for someone to be successful, honestly, is wishful thinking. So when you're really talking, oh yeah, Jen, jump in.
No, because I wanted to bring up here real quick that culture sometimes is an issue with roles and responsibilities. I ran into this last year with a company I was working with, and no one was allowed to question anything. So they weren't allowed to say, why do we do this? And it really created a culture where the roles and responsibilities weren't as clear as they thought. And it caused a lot of problems. So I think this is sometimes a culture thing that we don't think about how performance and how things are measured can be very helpful. So
Yeah, and I think expanding on that notion of culture is inherently what happens when you have multiple people and multiple perspectives and personalities all coming together into a collective experience. And that's where one of the ways that these roles and responsibilities need to look beyond a job description, because I may have a very clear understanding of my job. And even let's take that as a statement. I fully understand my job, my roles, my responsibilities. Things are going to come my way that are outside of that. And only knowing this is outside what I do is not enough to then effectively and efficiently make sure that the ball isn't dropped, right? I need to have a broader understanding of how my role interacts with other people in the firm, in the organization, who I lean on, who leans on me. There is an interactive and dynamic element of roles and responsibilities that I think often gets overlooked when we narrow it down to this notion of a job description. The last thing I'll say about this is that roles and responsibilities are never going to be fully clearly cut and dry. There is no universe in which this beautiful puzzle picture is exactly what it's going to look like in your firm, where the lines are super clear. And if you're out on this boundary, it is definitely Jen's job versus definitely Belle's job. And so there's also the importance in roles and responsibilities of acknowledging where those gray areas are, where there might be multiple people involved, where there could be different owners, and ensuring that part of the responsibilities is getting clarity in the moment when you find yourselves in one of those gray areas. I know that's not what most lawyers want to hear. They would like very clear lines, cut and dried. I'm sorry, that is not something I'm able to change.
perfectionism is a problem. Yes.
Which brings us to priorities. And yes, priorities does mean you're going to need to pick some favorites.
I'm scared. I want to do
Right?
it all.
My I have been told, I have not actually looked this up, but I choose to believe it's true and carefully do not look it up, that the word priorities did not exist until very recently, that priority was not a pluralizable noun, that the notion was you had a priority that was the top priority. And it is really only in the modern era that we have taken this notion of priority and made it plural. The
I've
expression,
never heard that, Belle, and I really like that because that actually makes a lot of sense in my logical brain.
right? This is why I choose not to research it. I like it as a fact. So, what the implications here are is that when you have 15 things that need to get done. Yeah, 15 things may need to get done. The reality is that all 15 things are probably not going to get done this week with the resources that are currently available and without a clear prioritization or stack ranking or guidance, you end up running the risk of people running in all 15 different directions. And making a little bit of progress on each of those 15 initiatives, I can tell you, is not going to feel like any progress at all. This is something that is easier said than done. Right, we all, I'm guessing anyone who is on this webinar is here because you have some ideas, right? What we're talking about today is going to be something that ends up on your priority list, and you're going to have to decide, is this something that is really important and needs to get done? And if so, what is it bumping off your list? And Jen, I don't know if you have,
I
if
have
this is
some
something a
thoughts. I
strong point.
this is my biggest downfall probably as a lawyer and just as an entrepreneur. Like you want to do it all and you have to make decisions. And sometimes I need an outside perspective to help me walk through what my priority should be, not what my priorities are, because what my priorities should be. And it's this is the hardest one, I think, for me personally. So
Yeah, and I'm gonna take your theme from earlier and also say that this is not just about setting a priority or priorities. This is about communicating them as well,
yeah.
because being very clear inside your own head, hugely beneficial, great first step. Not going to support your overall firm unless other people also know what it is that you have zeroed in on and decided. But once you have your roles and responsibilities, once you have your priorities, then it's time to figure out how all of these things get done. And one of my favorite tools for that is process mapping. And this is where we start to get into, again, some of these efficiency points. How do we head off some of the excuses that we talked through above? And for this one, I want to look at a firm where the partners were concerned about how money was flowing through the organization. They were pretty sure that there was some inefficiency, but only one person understood what was going on at all. And because there had been a relatively recent merger, was very real confusion around what the current practices were and where optimization may need to happen. This was not a complex process, to be clear. This was pretty straightforward at the beginning of the month. The invoicing cycle would start. The finance person would create something they called pre-bills. I'm guessing all y'all have some experience with pre-bills. The partners would review the pre-bills, make any correction, mark any corrections. Finance person would make the corrections, generate the preliminary invoices. Partners would review the invoices, again, make corrections. Partners would continue reviewing the invoices until there were no more corrections. Then the final invoices were generated and sent. It was helpful just to have this documented. And at this level, it seemed fairly straightforward. But as I dug in a little bit, I realized that there were a couple of pretty inefficient points here. And so we revised the process flow a little bit. And a lot of people are surprised when they see that the revised flow has more boxes and has more arrows, a little more complication than the original flow had. And that is because a little more thought actually ended up saving a ton of time. So let's make this a little bigger and see what's different. This was a firm where a couple different types of account. I'm not getting into a ton of the details, but basically one of the escrow accounts linked into the accounting software in a way that generating those initial invoices triggered the transfer of money. Now, we were not there to reset all of their systems, so we took this as a constraint we had to work with, but we realized that those were the only accounts where the pre-bills actually mattered. And the pre-bills were awful to read. They were this mishmash of just not user friendly data and information. And although these accounts had once been the majority of the business that this firm did, they were a tiny fraction of it now. And so the very first thing we did was say, hey, we're only going to have the partners review the pre bills for these accounts where it really matters. And that cut down a ton of partner time and stress right there. Then the next thing we did was have the partners review the invoices, these preliminary invoices. But when it was time to review the corrections, we had them only review the invoices that had been corrected. This was actually a really terrifying change for the partners because whether they wanted to talk about it or not, they recognized that they were human and that they might have missed something on that first review of the invoices that they were going to see when they did the full review after any corrections were made. They were kind of relying on that second check to make sure they hadn't missed anything. And so we went back and we looked. We went through the data and said, how often are changes being identified or issues coming up on that second review? And it did happen, but it was on the order of less than one change per partner per year. And when they really stepped back and thought about it, they decided that that was honestly an acceptable error rate when compared with the hours that they were spending re-reviewing every single invoice, most of which they'd already seen without any changes. So basically this ended up not only giving everyone in the firm clarity around the end invoicing process, but it was saving them over 2 hours of partner time per partner per month. And that added up really quickly. What I found most interesting was that the reason that they had ended up with this initial process was a historic culture of perfection at all costs. And what we were able to do with this documentation was to really say, what does all costs mean? Let's quantify those costs and see if there's maybe something we're willing to change here. There was again this long-term preference for the devil we know.
That's
And
a
Jen, I don't know
lawyer
if
thing.
you, yeah,
That's a
see
lawyer
the
thing.
mindset.
Lawyer, again, we have processes and that's how it's always been done. And that's my first clue that something needs fixing in a law firm is if they tell me, well, that's just how we've always done it.
And so when we get all of these documentation steps done, when we've got clear process maps and the maps align with the roles and the responsibilities, we tend to think we're good, right? Like we know everybody knows what their scope is. We know what our top priorities are. We've got a process. We're done, right? Next stage, engage. Not quite yet. Uh, Check-ins are really important here because remember the part where I said we cannot plan for everything. Something will come up that's a little confusing, and that excuse about I was handling it. When those situations arise, I have found that a preset standardized check-in, that's the moment where you're gonna be most likely to hear, hey, we might not be on the path we thought we're gonna be on. And if you think about, your own career, and there were times when you were reporting someone else, maybe you are now, in my experience, there's for most people a huge difference between having to raise your hand and say, hey, Jen, I've got a concern, I've got an issue, versus knowing I'm going to sit down with Jen, tomorrow, this afternoon. I'll just mention this. It really lowers the barrier to visibility and transparency. So early and often is good. Just making it a set time makes a big difference. And when we have the check-ins, that's going to give you a lot of the early warning, but you do also need to make sure that before you are in process, you have agreed with your team members about when you want them to ask for help. And this may feel like such a duh moment for you. I want them to ask for help when that rest of the sentence comes really easily to you. The challenge is it is not going to be the same for everyone, right? I personally, when I'm leading teams, tend to err on the side of I would like a heads up very early, but I don't expect my teams to ask for my intervention until they've tried a couple different things, right? I want to see that my teams have made an effort to, explore the solution space and create at least some remedy most of the time. And so this is something that can be really important to communicate, because I also know people who would like to intervene. They actually want to be asked for their help very early on, as soon as anything is starting to go wrong. Um, Cough, type A, cough, control, cough.
No,
Uh,
here.
Um, but I also know people who they really do not want teams asking for help until that's just the hand left in the quicksand, right? And there are pros and cons to every approach. What really matters is being aligned with your team members so that you are brought in no later than you want to be brought in when there is the need for help. And making it okay to ask for help ahead of time is going to cut off shockingly large number of the situations that end up talking about accountability after the fact.
And looking out how you respond to asks for help is really important, because it's very easy for it to turn into a complaint or event session, when really the ask for help should be, okay, what's the problem and what's the solution, or how can we solve it? I do find that we tend to get into this little quagmire of like, this, we're never going to fix this type things, and complaining and venting. So being able to move it on and create that culture of it's okay to ask for help, but also bring ideas and be open, having management open to ideas as well. So
Yeah, it's okay to ask for help, and when you do, I'm going to help you. Right?
exactly.
That
Let's come up with something that will be helpful.
Yeah, this is one of the areas where it's easy to spiral into that sort of devil moment, right? Someone asks for help and you look at it and you say, "Well, that's just a problem we've always had. We're going to accept this situation." And there are times where that is actually the right path. But make sure that you're doing that consciously and intentionally, and that you have truly tried solutions, that you're not doing it every time. Because if the answer is always, you're not going to get those requests, and something will fly under the radar that needed that conversation.
And if you don't listen when people ask for help, they'll stop asking, and then it'll become a bigger problem.
So that is setting the stage, right? Being really clear about that full scope of the roles and responsibilities, ensuring that there are not just clear priorities, but they have been communicated, having clarity around the actual execution, for example, using process maps, having the status checks to make sure that things can be raised early and often, and being on the same page about when those proactive ask for help moments need to happen. So now we get to engage. We get to actually do our work, be lawyers, help clients. Hooray! And this is where we really need everyone rowing together, uh, following all of those things that we did in step one. This is the sanity check, right? Setting the stage was all about making this part go smoothly, thinking through as much as you could ahead of time, making sure that you've got the pieces in place, ideally so that you can then have issues arise early and move into refinement, because the reality is that things are still going to go wrong even when you do all of that setting the stage. The key is that setting the stage is going to dramatically reduce the number of things that go wrong. And then when we've done our reflect and adjust, we just continuously reduce the number of things that go wrong.
I find that engagement is a great idea, but sometimes hard. Like the communication, like taking the time to consciously choose to engage and do the communications that are necessary is hard for lawyers, especially. But what I want lawyers to picture is a firm that shifts away from stress and overwhelm. Like picture your ideal firm and how it functions. Engagement and communication, where you openly discuss those gaps that are out there in your firm. It's mind-blowing to think about, like, okay, how cool would this be if my firm ran like this, and then how to get there. Engagement and communication are like super, probably the most important thing is the engagement part of this. So
Absolutely, right. Everything we talked about setting stage is about making the engagement feasible, functional,
Yep.
smooth. And I'm going to introduce, in concept at least, a researcher named Amy Edmondson. She recently had a book called The Right Kind of Wrong. And one of the key points she really, yeah, it's a fabulous book, highly recommend. One of the things she emphasizes is that there is not a contradiction between having high standards, having high expectations, and having a culture that openly addresses gaps, issues, errors, and mistakes. In fact, you need to have that kind of open communication if you want to get to that high standard, because how do you eliminate issues and errors if there's no awareness that they exist in the first place? Which brings us to reflect and adjust, because uh, lawyers may be perfect, but the rest of us, who the lawyers also work with, and maybe are sometimes, do need to figure out where we have been surprised by the ever shifting realities of the world around us. So, reflecting and adjusting is about making sure that we have put all of the things we did in setting the stage and our engagement into the best possible position.
And I think it's important to remember for lawyers, especially, that the stage is always going to be imperfect. No matter what you do, it's never perfect, and that's okay. And that actually helps you create better systems and processes when there is something imperfect, because then you can figure out the way forward. So I think it's hard for, as a lawyer, to say that something isn't perfect, but understanding that mindset shift will be key in a law firm to implementing all of this.
Which brings us to what we mean by imperfection. Because I think there's a tendency for a lot of us to immediately jump to the right side of this, and to say something went wrong. That means somebody did something wrong, with this very heavily implied did of intention behind it, right? That this was a conscious decision. That's what I often hear around the taking accountability is so and so messed up, dropped the ball, actively did this thing that went against what we wanted, was this huge violation. Reality is that is just a tiny fraction. That is incredibly rare, and that's really an HR issue, right? If you genuinely believe that somebody is deliberately messing things up, get HR involved, figure out how you're going to get that person the heck out of your firm, because nobody needs people on their team who are actively undermining the team. The bad news is, when you eliminate those deliberate issues, you are still left with the vast, vast, vast majority of everything that's going to go wrong, which is going to fall into these inadvertent errors that come back to the part where we're human. And I really like this distinction between the action errors and the thinking errors, where everything we've talked about is a lot of pre thinking, planning, making sure that we have the guidelines and the steps in place. If we're wrong, that's a thinking error, right? Somebody did exactly what they were asked to do, and it didn't have the outcome we wanted. That's going to happen sometimes. Or we gave the clear instructions, and they still didn't do it. Um, when you start to see a huge number of these action errors piling up when you're discussing them, when you're talking about remedy plans, that may also get to the point where it's just not the right person, not the right fit. But again, in my experience, that is the minority of the situations. Most often, what has happened is there's either a process issue, right? These thinking, planning challenges, or it is a kind of a one off, pretty rare, straight up mistake. And so, then thinking a bit more about what this means, back to our friend Amy Edmondson, there are these three types of failures. And realistically, most law firms are not going to find themselves in the complex failure zone very often, right? Jen referred back to the cases from the 1800s. This is a pretty well established field. There are people like Jen who are trying to blow up a lot of the thinking, and I love it. And the reality is that a lot of what you're changing is still kind of within the zone of common sense, still within what is plausible, right? That these are not the craziest ideas that have ever happened. It's taking common wisdom and replacing it with some maybe more up to date logic. That's not the complex failure zone. Complex failure is when you are changing large moving pieces in really complex systems. So that means most of what we're going to be dealing with is basic or intelligent failures. That last slide is really encapsulating the basic failures that you're going to have. So that gives you a way to kind of think about what's happening there. Intelligent failures, those are the good ones. I promised we'd have good ones. Uh, and so when you consciously decide, I'm going to try something new and different for a reason, and it doesn't work, great. You learned that that is not the way to do things, and you get to try something new and different. Now, part of making those decisions, doing those experiments, does require you to think through a little bit. If this doesn't work, what is the potential failure? How do I minimize the negative impact? But if you don't ever try something new, you're never going to get improvements. And if you're trying something new, you have to accept that sometimes it's not going to go exactly as planned. And Jen, I don't know if you want to weigh in on any of
I mean,
these.
errors, I think lawyers feel like errors are always failures. And so I like the way this is laid out on here. And I do like the intelligent errors because that means we're trying new things and figuring out how to make things better. So, yeah.
And once we've thought through all these errors, we figured out, do we have mistakes? Do we have planning, thinking errors? This is where we get to reset the stage. We get to go back and look at how do we improve these structures, these processes that everything builds on, because we're never going to be perfect on paper. There will always be room for some improvement. The goal is to make sure we're sort of zeroing and spiraling in on as close as we can get to perfection until something in the broader world changes and we have to, our processes that were ideal for a pre-pandemic situation, for example, suddenly all need to be adjusted because we're in a pandemic, we're in a post-pandemic world, right? We've had a lot of change recently. Hopefully there's not going to be quite the same level of upheaval, but a new law might come out that changes quite a bit about how you need to run your practice. And that's going to be a whole new reason to reset the stage, even if you've dealt with all of your internal challenges.
And the legal world is changing. Technology and AI is changing a lot of things. I do a lot of talking about AI and legal practice. And being open to that type of technology and resetting your stage every once in a while helps keep you on top of even competencies that the bar isn't going to require from us in our law practices. So there are good reasons to reset the stage, even not just accountability in your law firm, but accountability to your client and the bar.
So when we've done all of this, we've talked through all of this, hopefully you're feeling pretty inspired, you're ready to get going. Let's jump into our actionable strategies. What do we actually do to move forward? We're going to give you these slides, so I'm not going to read the 8 million words on here to you right now. But there are reflection questions, right? You may have noticed setting the stage had 5 steps. Here are 5 questions you can ask yourself to see which of those pieces of setting the stage is a good one for me to start with, to really dive in on and start thinking about. This is just a reminder that accountability is your secret weapon, right? It's not a silver bullet. It is going to be something with a little bit of effort and iteration comes pretty darn close, right? When your teams understand their position, their scope, their authority, when they are all raising their hands when needed, when you are communicating effectively, you're going to find that things go much more quickly, much more smoothly. Your clients are happier, and perhaps best of all, you stop having to have the constant conversations about why so and so didn't take accountability. So let's sort of wrap it all up. How do we take it from here? If you are all set, you are good to go. You've got these lessons that we've taken, we've shared, no questions. Awesome. Have at it. If you're still not sure where to start, 2 ways you can do. One, kind of looking backwards, just set aside a few minutes and think about something that was really frustrating recently. What went wrong? When were you talking about accountability? And now when you're thinking about it, how does it fit into everything we've talked about? Or just listen to yourself moving forward, right? Over the next week or two, when do you use the word accountability? When do you wish accountability was more of a factor? that's a great place to pull up those reflection questions and get to work. Plus, we've got some offers. Jen, yeah.
And if you feel like you're ready to figure this out and you want to jump in, we do have two offers on the next slide for you. So Belle and I approach this from different perspectives. If you don't even know where to start and you just want to talk through like the frustrations you have in your firm and talk to a lawyer about maybe the same frustrations she may have had in your firm, I have a offer that I do, perception versus reality, where we talk about accountability. It's 3 hours of consulting. I have it regularly priced at $1,500. It is $997 through April 26th, so a week from today. I do only have 5 spots left because I have to limit my time that I have available for this. And a special bonus, if you sign up today, you also get a 30-minute client experience assessment, which is always fun to figure out how your clients experience your firm. So I have the link up there. And then, so if you know what your problems are, where your accountability is, and you don't need to start there, then Belle has something for you that will be very helpful.
Yeah, and so I have worked with several law firms, several law firm coaches to develop what I think of as the starter kit of process maps for law firms. So these are generic process maps that really break out the steps across partners and staff and clients for onboarding, invoicing, and quality control. And so, what this package comes with is those three standard maps and then a 1 hour consultation to really dig in on the optimization and customization that you'll want to put in place for your firm. And similarly, if you do sign up today, I'll make that 90 minutes versus just the 60 minutes. And so usually that whole package is 1050, but we're doing 750 for the next week, and only 5 available on my end as well for the joy of time management, right? Those priorities we talked about. We are trying to put into practice for ourselves the things that we are suggesting for everyone else.
It's always a work in progress, though. And if you think you can think of someone you should share this with, feel free to send it out. We will have a YouTube video for attendees as well. The slides, if you log into your Lawyer Success Network account, the slides will be there as well with the video later this afternoon. So if you don't have a Lawyer Success Network account, you should go sign up and get on our mailing list for our future programs that we're doing. And go to Belle's website too, bellevueconsulting.com, and sign up for her newsletter. Great information. There was a couple questions. There was a Q&A, and then there was a chat. One person had asked to repeat the 5 questions. I did copy paste those in there so that you would have them in writing, because sometimes people learn better by seeing them in writing. If there are any other questions, please let us know. You can type in chat to the hosts if you don't want your Q&A seen out there by everyone. Sometimes people don't like to ask questions that way, but Belle and I are always very open. We like to discuss this kind of thing on a regular basis. We're total nerds like that. So you could always reach out to us and let us know if you have questions or other things, or if you think this presentation was helpful and you have a bar association who would benefit, or a affinity group of some sort, let us know. We're happy to go on the road with it. So thank you, Belle, for partnering on this, and happy Friday, everyone.
Happy Friday. Have a fabulous weekend. Thank you so much, Jen, for letting me expound a little bit on how we can approach accountability as a process, not just a moment.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Okay.
All right.